Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the CFA Society Switzerland's webinar on U.S. elections 2020. Does it really matter who wins for global investors? Please use the Q&A symbol to ask questions. After the presentation, these questions will be discussed. Our speaker today is Christian Takushi. Christian is a macroeconomist with 31 years experience in research, portfolio management, and strategy focused on emerging markets and geopolitics. Since 2015, he produces independent geopolitical research, advising policymakers and investors. For example, he predicted the election of Trump in 2016. He uses a proprietary geopolitical approach and data aggregation methods to analyze trends that are underestimated by consensus, but have the potential to affect the real economy. Welcome, Christian.
Yes, thank you very much, Sheila, for this kind introduction. I am very honored to be here again, and thank you for the renewed invitation of the CFA Society. I would like to invite everyone to participate in a poll. I hope that it should be showing up now on your screens any moment. And it's a small poll, just inviting you to share your view on who you think will be winning these elections. You're so kind just to click your answer in there. We'll be receiving the results momentarily on the screen as well. As a small introduction on my side, I would like to say that what you're going to hear from me today is not a typical, political analysis on the U.S. presidential elections 2020. There are people, obviously, in the United States that are more capable in doing such a thorough analysis on the U.S. This presentation today will be a rather global perspective, strategic perspective, also historical, and how we could put this current US presidential elections into perspective, global perspective, historical perspective, also in the perspective of the big global trends that are already in place or entrenched. So this is the perspective I will be given, and that's why I will like to introduce you to a global geopolitical perspective first of these big trends that are already in place and that I believe neither President Trump nor Vice President Biden can change or alter. And then we will go a little bit into the US presidential elections. So if you don't mind, we'll try to get a global perspective first before we discuss a little bit of the United States presidential elections this year. And finally, a few takeaways before we move on to the Q&A. Well, I'm seeing here already some answers. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. So from what I can see is 12% expect Trump to win, 65% expect Biden to win, and 24% say this is too close to call. And this is actually a very interesting result. I think it's pretty rational to do this. This very much reflects the current state of expectations and analysis that I'm tracking. When we put everything together that is being done now to predict these elections, this comes very close to it. I would like now to take over with my slides, if you don't mind. Apologies, I've been speaking a lot in recent weeks, so my voice might be a little bit scratched from time to time. Let's go into the presentation. I just have something just to mention here. Civilization faces two major threats: excess of thermonuclear warheads and excess of paper money. And yes, I would like to be very straightforward. I don't know to what extent Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump can help us with that. In any way, I think they might be accelerating those trends one way or the other. here is my agenda. First, I would like to highlight some big geopolitical macro trends that are already in place. They're already going on, they're entrenched. Second, I would like to look at the major issues that investors might be overlooking at the moment. And then we go into the US presidential elections, okay? And finally, some takeaways. I've tried to reduce my presentation to a minimum, and I will be using a few slides just for illustration. Thank you for bearing with me. And at the bottom, also something about our key principle or approach. All nations and groups tend to advance their interests with all means at their disposal. We try to understand them instead of passing judgment. And I also like to add, I look at every nation, every administration, president, person in public office with respect. We try not to pass judgment on anyone. So this is part of the objectivity that I like to use. So I try to put also my own personal views aside. I really try to do this very, very thoroughly. And if by any ways something I say or write should offend someone, but thank you for giving me some understanding, some grace, and bearing with me today. Nothing negative is intended here. Okay, these are the 10 most important global trends that we see at the moment, or developments that we see. They have some power, some momentum, and that I believe no US president will be able to really reverse. Maybe slow down for some time, hold up for some time, but not reverse. And let's go through them briefly. The massive military buildup, arms race in the world is going on, and if anything, is accelerating. Second, the political stability in the Northern Hemisphere is fading away. It is really fading away. At the same time, that part of the world is aging fast. The whole Northern Hemisphere, from China, Japan, Korea, to Russia, Ukraine, to Western Europe, the United States, they're aging fast. Third, the center of Christianity shifts to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The Middle East is stabilizing. China is increasing its nuclear first strike capability and also its control over much of the West. A doomed NATO, basically because the EU cannot defend herself, neither can it defend the United States. It can only draw the US into a war. Brazil is shaking up Latin America. The socialist Mercosur is facing a capitalist Pacific alliance. Quite interesting what's going on there in that part of the world. The United States in a resurgence, geopolitically, militarily, you could say, but with growing system vulnerabilities. And then a perfect storm, I believe, is in the making in Europe. And this could actually bring down the European Union, but it is very clear what will be the next step. A European superstate is inevitable, in my view. Finally, freedom of speech and competition is declined and being cut back across the West and in many other countries as well. They go hand in hand. Competition is being pushed back or crowded out by the power of oligopolies. And they do really kind of, have a certain interconnection. They live from one another, freedom of speech and competition. In a way, I would say the West is converging towards China, and surveillance will only increase. Let's look at a few interesting cases, because I've been speaking about convergence. This actually entrenched trends, or trends with momentum, are not just existing there. I just showed 10. Actually, we're following 16 of them. These are the 10 most important ones. They're not just entrenched and enjoying some momentum or accelerating, they're also converging with one another. And just look at 3 areas where we see some convergence of economic and geopolitical, political forces. Let's look at the imploding labor force and the runaway monetary policy. They are interconnected and to some extent, helping give life to each other and strengthen each other. The trends that started in the 1970s are converging. paper money is being printed at an amazing pace because markets are looking away. They are enjoying their ride. They're not doing their homework. Markets should be there like checking balances for government. They used to be like that. They don't do it anymore. There's a moral decay. Markets don't mind being managed by governments so they can seek higher, price assets. Labor force implosion is deflationary. Easy money used to be inflationary, but excessive, radically excessive, massive monetary expansion is deflationary. We end up with a potentially money illusion. And what we see here is a very interesting situation where for many years now, the governments can stage a managed rally in bond, stock, and real estate prices. A very interesting development that is connected to other things in the world. Now, second area, vulnerable trading routes, they're becoming more and more vulnerable, just as the global supply chain is also showing some problems. This is got to do with security. I believe that investors are underestimating the factor of security. We are taking security for granted. Just to make a point, I don't want to touch on every single point, but let me pick on number 3 there. The EU, including Switzerland, are now seen as a semi-combatant state by Sunni Arab nations. That's because some 10 years ago, 11 years ago, the EU began to embrace Tehran. In the past, Europe was kind of neutral in the Sunni-Shia conflict. It no longer is. Switzerland is attached to EU foreign policy. So there is some things related to security here in our global supply chain. And I believe the COVID-19 crisis in 2020 was just a little foretaste of what is coming later in this decade. Number 3, the West is enabling the rise of autocratic geopolitical powers like China. We are enabling them, and without our full support, they wouldn't actually rise so fast. China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran are on the rise, and Western governments and big corporations are shifting production to autocratic, hegemonistic states to reduce their cost, but without thinking ahead what that means. What I'm saying here is the following. Had the West demanded a little bit of reciprocity from China, we will probably see today a kind of open, to some extent, democratic China, not like we have in the West, but a more democratic China, saying to them, you want to participate in global trade? Please, you have to provide some freedom of speech and political liberties to your people, gradually, per, maybe, right? Instead of that, we told them, you can do whatever you want. You can put as many dissidents in jail and use them as labor force. We're going to give you everything, access to our market. So why should Beijing then go into democracy? Why should they give democracy to the people and liberties and freedom of speech? If I would advise China, I would tell them, no, you don't have to do it. You already have access to the markets and they have become dependent on you. Take advantage of that. Don't give people any freedoms. Actually, the opposite, get tougher on them. And that's exactly what China is doing. So the West here, I believe, is responsible for the deterioration of, of civil liberties and civil rights in China. I don't want to stay too long on this chart. This is just to show to you that the different areas of conflict and tension in the world are actually overlapping with one another, interacting with one another, and overlapping with other areas or hotspots. And that is actually intensifying. And you see here just the last 4 years, this is intensifying. This is just telling us that a big crisis could happen any moment. We just need the trigger. This doesn't forecast it. It just says that an external trigger in the world could actually usher a major crisis. Yeah. I would like to be a little bit, I'd like to move to a slightly more direct statement. Can Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump stop these major trends? I would say no, it's very unlikely. To please their bases, they're actually going to have to feed some of these trends and making this, probably even an accelerated process. The aging and the implosion of the labor force in the Northern Hemisphere, I think the markets don't take it seriously enough. It's happening. Money printing, debt bubble, and deficit financing enabled by the moral decline in the markets. I don't think that Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump are going to address this. They cannot afford for it, because to fulfill their campaign promises, they will have to accept the current status quo. The decline of real disposable incomes in the West, that is already going on for a few decades, fueled by the declining competitions as I see it, increasing regulation and the rise of oligopolies. I don't think that either of them are willing to do that. President Trump wanted to do it, but he wanted the stock market to do well too at the same time. So he actually decided to let the stock market run. The arms race fueled by the second Cold War, as some people call it. I call it everyone for himself, with more alliances than competing nations. I think that, yes, would be quite different depending if we get Mr. Biden, Mr. Trump in the White House, but it just be a different kind of conflicts, but we're gonna have a continuation of conflicts. And the rise of the liberal globalist forces, if you allow me to define them as this liberal left globalist forces, I don't think that rise can be stopped. I believe it has so much momentum in the world, so systemic, in arts, it's in universities, it's in media, that in schools already at kindergarten. So it is going to be probably very difficult for that to be reversed. That is a powerful trend that can probably be slowed down for some time, but not reversed. And a major reset that is looming, I believe. A monetary, economic, and military reset is looming, actually, to some extent, inevitable. I don't see Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden reversing this or even stopping this. And I've been paying attention to almost all of their interviews and presentations and programs, explanations. I don't see any hint of that. The first message here to investors is that they should not expect too much from who enters into the White House. Actually, maybe it might be more important who wins the Senate, the GOP or the DNC. That question, I think, might be a little bit more important. But for the big trends in the world that may be impacting financial asset prices in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or for the rest of this decade, I think that who wins the White House this year may disappoint some people. Of course, the first couple of weeks and months, markets may take a different turn, but I'm not here to do that. There are people that are more capable than I am to predict the reaction of the markets in the first 1 or 2 weeks. Of course, it makes a difference whether it is Trump or Biden, but I try not to look at that. My job is research and strategic research, so I try to look at multi-year trends. And when I do that, I don't see a major difference between who wins this contest today. Let's look at a few of those very important strategic trends that I believe investors are overlooking a little bit at the moment. I'm not going to look at too many, just a few. There is a process of erosion of disposable real incomes in the West. And that process is accelerating. It's got to do with demographics, something that many economists don't like to talk much about because we cannot influence it so much. And when we talk about demographics, I think we also like to overlook the old age dependency ratio, which I believe is the most powerful ratio to look at from investors' perspective. This is a chart that I created based on data, publicly available data. And it just shows the proportion of elderly people to working age people. And the higher it is, the more, the bigger the squeeze on disposable income, because we have to pay for these elderly people by taxes, by transfers. It doesn't matter how. The government is going to get the money. In places like Japan or China, there is no law about it, but the local government can put you in jail if you don't take care of your parents. It's just a different culture. And as you see, for a long time, this ratio was between 10 and 20. 10 and 20 is fantastic for economic growth. Let's put it this way. The moment we go above 20, growth begins to be hindered because people cannot spend money freely for what they would like to do. They have to save for their parents. And you see that in countries like South Korea, China, Germany, Japan, this ratio is doubling, tripling, quadrupling in this generation. And I'm looking at this generation from 2015 to 2040. And in this generation that has just begun this 25-year span, there is a doubling, tripling, quadrupling of this ratio in important countries. It's dramatic. This is going to have a tremendous impact on political stability, a higher demand for mass migration, and in Europe, it's going to increase the influence of Turkey and the Middle East on Europe as well. It's going to be very interesting what it's going to do. Finally, let me mention this. True deflation is not negative CPI, but shrinking balance sheets. And I mentioned this here because the question comes up often. I'm not going to stay too much time on this chart. I think many of you are acquainted with debt to GDP ratios. Just to say that the Western nations are highly indebted, but the credit ratings don't reflect that. The credit ratings of Western European nations look better than the credit ratings of mid-income emerging nations whose public finances are looking much, much healthier. And so I believe that there is a problem here. One thing I would like you to look at is at the bottom right. You see here how GDP has exploded in the last 4 decades, but how this, real incomes or earnings have actually stagnated. If you take the top 10% of earners there, the very wealthy, this has actually been going down sideways. And this is interesting. Also, markets, people say markets have decoupled from the economic reality. So we should sell stocks. I say, well, let's be careful because this process didn't start in March, April this year, it started 40 years ago. We have a massive trend, which I believe is also connected with the moral decline of financial markets. Financial markets are not doing their job. They're just allowing policymakers to manage the markets. They just want to see higher asset prices. They are not doing the balancing checks that we used to do. Okay, let's move on. Something that I believe will make China even more assertive than it has been in recent years, it started in 2013 with President Xi Jinping, is that the massive ODR shock that China is going into. China wants to shift growth to domestic consumption. It cannot. Very simply because the workforce has begun to implode. We're just here where you see this arrow. From here, it goes downhill fast, and the number of elderly is going to explode as well. So this means ODR shock, which means massive squeeze in disposable real incomes. China see more tension internally. It will have to be much more assertive in foreign policy versus its neighbors, versus the West, etc. And now that the West is in the trap, supply side wise, in the trap of China, I believe that China is going to get only more assertive. Another example, I think also something that investors are overlooking is the dramatic change of the geopolitical situation in the Middle East. The blue, I'm a bit colorblind, a little bit colorblind, but as you can see, the blue, the first circle in the middle is blue. This used to be the radius of, or the reach of Iranian ballistic missiles. What our experts in the West, in Europe, believe and say it is. Well, this no longer is. Iran has successfully, developed a very powerful carrier for ballistic missiles that takes their missiles up to 3,400 kilometers. So places like Berlin, Geneva, Zurich, Marseille, Stockholm are now within reach. And the good thing is the technology is there, but they still have to move their ballistic missiles onto these carriers. That can take some time, can take 12 months, can take 2 years. It depends. The beautiful things for Iran is they have now 2 very powerful nations that can help them do that. One is China, one is Russia. And they have a very close cooperation with either of them, with both of them. So it's very likely that Iran will do this faster than it would be faster than slower. So My personal take at the moment is June, July next year. And very interestingly, as soon as this test was successful, Iran immediately issued a very stern threat to the United States that it would like to use this against the US, but in the same sentence it added Europe. It would like to use it against Europe too. Interestingly, I think because Europe, the EU, the Western Europe has been the economic bloc that has enabled Iran to develop the missiles in the last 5 years. So it's very interesting how things are. The very nations that the West is relying on are actually treating the West kind of harshly. These trends are taking place and are actually not going away. Yeah, I would like to finish this part with just 10 forecasts that I make, because this is, shouldn't we just look at what it is until now? I want to give you a glimpse of what I see for the rest of the decade and beyond, okay? I hope that you can enjoy this by yourself. If you can, please just look at the 3 points in red. Number 4 is in red, number 7 and number 9. I believe a debt crisis, a global currency reform are inevitable in this decade. And at one point, I see an exodus of capital and people to the Southern Hemisphere as well. Very simply, our procrastinations and shortcomings will be catching up with us in the West and for the West. And at the bottom, I see a great normalization. Central banks have been inflating financial wealth, inflating stock prices, bond prices, real estate. They have been inflating financial wealth over the last, not just 1 decade, even longer than that, the last 1, 2, 3 decades. Some people say, some will say 4 decades. Doesn't matter. What has been inflated will be deflated at one point, and people will look at that as wealth destruction. I don't see this as wealth destruction. I see this as monetary normalization. Okay, let's look a bit about the US now. Let's go a little bit closer to the US election, which is where we wanted to look. And I'm not spending too much time. I will just look at, I'm not a US political analyst. I just show to you some things that I personally, as a person outside of the US, see about these elections. First of all, a lot of people here in Europe are, shocked to see, the fighting and the bickering in Washington, and they think that the US is finished. I like to remind people, especially in Europe, that the founding fathers in the US designed the system to be like that, for a lot of balance and checks, for basically Washington to remain in a stalemate so that it doesn't get too powerful, that to protect the rights of the people, of the citizens and the states. One thing that I also think is very interesting is the way that, people have become now agitators or political activists. It seems that, and this is the thing, is a sad development, that a lot of people with, even in public office, are also, professors, economists, journalists. They are no longer informing or sharing objective research and analysis. Many of them have an agenda either on the left or the right, and they don't mind being political activists. It's a very interesting development that I think is very worrisome. There is also growing animosity in the US, as you probably see. I don't think that civil violence and martial law are very unlikely. I think that could happen. And what I believe now I mentioned this, to predict who is going to win in this election, I think is difficult, as difficult as it was in 2016. People say, Takushi, you predicted 2016, but I have to say it was difficult. And the difficulty is, I think, is because of the math. Not many people vote in the United States. 330 million people, only 245 are eligible, and of those, maybe 140 million will be voting. And in every state, you have different rules. Some people can still vote very late, some not. And given the agitation that we see today, the mobilization of voters, who goes out, the enthusiasm, who goes out, who can be mobilized, plays a big role. And because of the things here, I would like to say, let's be careful with the predictions and polls we see so far. In recent years, we also have to say, in the last 10, 12 years, most of the polls kind of like to err on the left. They predicted, some of them were predicting the left will win, even when it was clear that the right, the conservative side will win. So the polls are seldomly erring in favor of conservatives. They seem to be always erring in favor of the left or liberal, especially in very crucial elections or decisions. It's just something that I've observed in recent years. So we have to just take all this with a little bit of caution, I think, all these predictions, etc. I believe it's difficult. Yeah, I believe that the current, when I look at all the analysis, the data, and the polls, and all the debated facts, if I would say so, because there's a lot of facts that nobody cares about, but all the debated facts, they clearly actually favor Mr. Joe Biden. If he wins, everybody will say, I told you it was a clear case. You know, everybody will say that it was so clear. Of course, I told you he will win. The timing of the economic devastation, the timing of this economic devastation through COVID-19 is amazing. It's amazing. To the month, a week, you could say, was perfectly timed, or it's just, you know, coincidence. It happened. It's devastating. And I think it is just in favor of the Democrats. And I think that there's a lot of, you know, conspiracy theorists out there. I don't like to work with that. I just have to say, we have to assume the Democrats are very lucky this year. Without COVID-19, I wonder if the current situation would be so too close to call. But it's not just COVID-19. I believe the GOP, the Republicans, made a big mistake because this COVID-19 exposed the lack of universal healthcare in the US. Quite a lot of conservatives are very angry with me when I mention I believe the US should have a better healthcare system. I think this is the biggest flaw or weakness that the GOP has in its policy. The racial confrontation also favors Mr. Biden. The Hispanic vote, I think, is also very clear, but many people know this. One thing that is very interesting is, I think, also that the far left wing has a very good control or influence on the party this time, unlike 2016. So I think the Sanders vote should be a little bit more secure than in 2016. Also, the Tide Media Shield, I call it that way, sorry. I just got the media is really helping Mr. Biden. Everything that is bad about him is being cut back, is not being shared. So they're really helping Mr. Biden. The only thing I'm wondering if it is almost too impressive, too coordinated, could it backfire? Overall, the DNC is running, I believe, a much better, much more coordinated campaign than the GOP. I have to say that. A question, could Mr. Trump win? If he would win, if there would be this surprise, what would trigger it? I believe this could be, these are the most likely triggers for that. And the biggest one, I think, is federal judge Amy Coney Barrett. I think she is kind of helping at the moment tip the balance a little bit in some key states in favor of Mr. Trump. And I think it is a precedent again. Okay, she's a superb candidate, but the real issues, I think the mistake the liberal circles did and the Democrats did in the first 2 weeks after the announcement of this, they really attacked her, and many did, unfortunately, attack her on her faith. Some people said that a person of Catholic faith or faith cannot be reconcilable anymore with any high public office in the US. It does insinuations like that or comments like that that I think hurt and angered a lot of white and Hispanic Catholics. And, you know, the Democrats need those Hispanics to win this election. So this is where it's interesting to know how many, Hispanics and white Catholics support Democrats. Then there is also this strong support that Mr. Trump gave to Israel, Christianity, and the unborn life in the last 3 years that has probably helped to keep these Catholic and evangelicals that dislike Mr. Trump's character. they dislike him. Some of them really dislike him, but they say, well, at least he's been really doing the things that support our cause. Religion, I believe, is one of the most is one of the biggest factors that we overlook. Yeah, I believe religion factors and studying religious undercurrents in the United States helped me expect the outcome in 2016 of the elections then. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if religion again this time would play a bigger role. And like in 2016, the analysts, the media, they're very cautious. They only scratch the surface because they don't want to talk too much about religion. Okay, Mr. Trump is the underdog now. That sometimes can help, where I'm actually finishing now. I believe, and I mentioned this earlier, the way things are in the world today, and as much as I think these elections matter to many people, the way things are developing now, the Senate race might turn out to be more important than the White House race. And the reason is, when you look at the programs that Mr. Biden wants to implement, he needs the Senate to pass them. He needs the Senate. If the Republicans lose the White House, but they can keep the Senate, it's not too bad, after all, because the future President Biden will still have to face the scrutiny of the, of the Congress, of Senate, and the judges, the Supreme Court, etc. Yeah. So when you look at the Senate, there is not a big majority there, 53 to 47 for the Republicans, but interestingly, 35 Senate seats are up for grabs in re-election very soon. And there are already, at the moment, it looks like there is a slight advantage for the Democrats there, but it's not a tremendous advantage that can still be changed in the coming weeks. So it may end up just being decided by 7 states. 6 to 7 states, how the Senate looks like on November 3rd. And I believe the Senate is what investors should watch the most. This is what I believe. Of course, the presidential elections, the White House race, that is the big news in the first couple of weeks after the elections. But if you want to look at what will be important for the rest of the term, presidential term, the next 4 years, it is the Senate. So look at the Senate and pay a bit less attention to what is happening for the White House. Okay, I'm finishing with this. Thank you so much. This is just, I've said all of this. This is kind of repetition. You can dwell on it a little bit. I think that the big trends are entrenched. Very little the president of the US can do, I think, in the next few years to reverse this. The influence of China will continue to grow in the US, even if President Trump wins. Very underestimated factors, not just for US elections, but in general for geopolitics in the world, and the economy, religion, money illusion, what is happening now in the monetary system, and Russia, because Russia, I think, feels increasingly pushed back, encircled, and threatened. And finally, this little statement. I believe that most institutional investors, pensions, banks, wealth management companies, family offices, and I look at a lot of portfolios, are still having a flow diversification. Most of the diversification I see is based on what we saw the last 20, 30 years, maybe 40 years. And it's not really taking into account what is going to happen in the rest of this decade, or maybe the next 1 or 2 decades. And I think that strategic diversification has to look forward, even as difficult as it is today to look forward, even with the little visibility that people have. But you can't say there's no visibility out there, have no idea how the future will be. I think we know. There is some things that we can see, and it's very, very different from the past 20 years. So I think that investors have to look forward, have to dare to have an outlook of the future, and based on that, no matter how vague it is, make a decision for the strategic benchmarks and the strategic diversification. As it is today, most investors that I see have 80% of their assets clustered in the Northern Hemisphere. Not just that, It's clustered in the areas that are depending on the sea lanes that are most at risk over the next 10 years. So they're investing in areas that are highly at risk through geopolitical risks. Yeah, and most of the geopolitical risks, 85% of them for the next 10 to 15 years are clustered in the Northern Hemisphere, especially in areas where investors have invested most of their money. So I think that that is how I would like to end. And I want to thank you again for your kind attention and for giving me also a few extra minutes. Thank you.
Christian, thank you very much. Just a couple questions. Maybe we can start with just an overall question. Geopolitical risk is often defined as what intergovernment actions are and macroeconomics. We're seeing, empowered by the role of the internet, we're seeing more consumer-oriented initiatives that are getting traction. For example, ESG, where investors and consumers are saying, whatever their government says, they're saying, making decisions of what sort of policies, for example, in China and the workforces are acceptable to the consumer. Do you see that as becoming an important influence in the geopolitical sphere?
I think so. I believe that the social media technology, but also the rise of ESG can be a powerful tool, a powerful instrument. And I think where the big players have lost a little bit of the moral compass, not necessarily because they're evil, just because of the forces. Look at the investors; they're under such a regulatory, grid. They have such a regulatory pressure. They have other things to worry about. So I believe that if consumers, investors, can get involved with ESG, ESG cannot just be a nice marketing tool, but a powerful transformational, tool for society and for financial markets. Yes, I'm a very big friend. I hope that ESG will get also teeth. It's a fantastic concept. It's a fantastic thing that is rising. I just would like to see it having teeth. And at the moment, it doesn't have so much teeth. Look, I meet every now and then investors that are using a lot of ESG. They say to me they don't invest in Iran and North Korea because of human rights there, etc. And I ask them, how about China? And yeah, they smile and change topics. Say, Mr. Takushi, come on, you need to make money, it cannot be. So it's just the way it is. Yeah. So I would like ESG to be a bit more, successful in helping us, just be consequential with what we're doing. And I think I'm not trying to be here against China, really. I receive very nice, even compliments and feedbacks from China because I treat them with respect. I think that if we in the West do stand up for our values, our Judeo-Christian values, our liberal values, as we call them, as our European values, as we call them, or American values, and also implement ESG honestly, we will not be able to do everything with China that we're doing today, but ultimately we're going to be helping China. I believe that what we're doing at the moment is not helping China.
Interesting. Just one other question, sort of macro question. Your old age dependency ratios were obviously very alarming and moving in a very disturbing way. One of the solutions to that is immigration. You can easily affect the your age profile by changing your immigration policies. Do you think that right now immigration is a political hot topic, but do you think that the old age dependency ratios will ever become so worrying that it will lead to a change in the popular view of immigration?
Yes. At the moment, we're seeing a backlash to this liberal pro-globalization movement that we had for 4 decades. People are against immigration, but I think it's momentarily. The deterioration of the ODR ratio is so grave, so difficult, so bad in the next 10, 15 years that it will force many nations, many Western nations, to resume mass migration. Mass migration will be resumed. You can count on it. The problem that people have is maybe the type of people that are being invited in. And this is where I think the political issue is. in Brussels, many political leaders and thought leaders for instance, in Western Europe, they would like to see, and this is their vision, they would like to see a Christian Islamic or Islamic Christian Europe. So they would like to see not just more Europeans being invited in. So some of these thought leaders, and they are very influential, would like to see Turkey rather being more young people from Turkey being invited in than, you know, people from Australia, let's say, okay? And allow me to show you why. We'll go back to this chart. I think that everybody can see. You see this, sorry, my computer colorblind, there's something dark blue here right in the middle, like a little flat circle.
Yes, yes.
This is the ODR of Turkey, which is hovering around 11.5 at the moment. Turkey will have some 87 million people by the middle of this decade. A powerful nation. Most of them are young, and their ODR is very low. Turkey has everything that the European Union needs. It has high inflation, it has a lot of young people, and it has a Muslim population. This is what many thought leaders in Europe would like to see. They don't speak it very loud because they know there's too much, it's not politically correct to speak it like that, but this is a wish that they have. So there are many political leaders in Western Europe. They would prefer to see more Muslim people coming rather than more Americans and more Irish. So they would like to have a more global, a more mixed up, you know, more diverse, sorry, a more diverse population too. But for sure, more mass migration is coming. The question is the composition, the cultural background of those people that will be coming. I think I understand the noble ideas that some European leaders have, but I think that they are maybe underestimating the long-term potential, you know, political issues that may arise from that. But I think they're coming, and I don't think that we'll be able to avoid them.
Thank you. It's interesting, in the 60s, Germany went down and invited guest workers from Turkey. And certainly, you know, the economic cycle has changed, but it can change again, as we see.
Yeah, sorry, you mentioned that. I want to say I'm very glad that you mentioned that because it worked for Germany. The Turkish that came to Germany assimilated very well. Look, if you travel to Germany, you see what a success story that has been. Some of them are also in German politics. So because of that, I think some European leaders believe they should stick to it. And the population in Turkey is much younger than in Ireland or Australia or the United States.
Well, we'll see what happens. What we do know is that change is possible. Major change is possible. Let me ask you a question from Philip Sundquist, who says, given the major trends outlined in your presentation, what is your expectation for the US dollar as the world's reserve currency?
The US dollar is, you know, under some pressure. Some people may even say under threat. I respect the many economists that believe the US dollar's days are counted. I mean, it is possible. In today's challenging times, there are so many converging geopolitical and economic forces that could trigger a major crisis anytime. Our current world is operating under control. Governments have to control ever more of everything to avoid our economies tipping into inflation or deflation. So government control is not because they're evil. They have to have this control, even of the markets, the bond yield, the yield curve, everything controlling. But what that means is an external shock could at any time trigger a major crisis. Such a thing would, of course, bring an end to the current financial system. Now, I disagree, though, in the idea that the US dollar will disappear as a top currency. The world is in difficulties, the US dollar is challenged, but I believe that those experts that say the US dollar will disappear are underestimating the role of military power and security. There is no other military power in the world that can challenge the United States. Russia and China would have to take out the US first for them to be just at a real play level field. There is not a complete play level field yet because the US is the only big military power that can control the sea lanes without military power, there is no security. Without security, there is no economic prosperity, no trade. I think many economists and investors take the security for granted. Security is not provided by some, invisible hand. Security is provided at the moment by the United States of America in conjunction with Britain. I mean, the United States and Britain together have the biggest network of military bases around the world, together with a few other NATO partners in Japan. That's how the US provides for security for global trade. Because of that, I don't see the US dollar disappearing so fast. I would rather say, if we have a reset, it's likely that the US will set a preemptive currency reform in motion, maybe announce a massive default on US Treasury debt, on US government debt, at the same time as it announces a currency realignment, let's say a depreciation of the dollar of 40%, but at the same time, a backing of the dollar by gold. That is at the moment, one of the more likely scenarios, although there are many, but it's one of the more likely scenarios. And I think this is something that the world may accept in a transition phase. In a transition phase, I see a role for the dollar and a role for gold. Longer term, the way things are going, I understand where Mr. Sandquist is coming. I think that the US will have to yield to a digital currency solution longer term, but that would be at the end of the transition process. And I think that's what China wants. So in the long run, China will get its way, I think.
As long as we're talking about sort of supranational technology solutions, we do see the technology field and companies being almost a force unto themselves, a global force. And Andrea Mognan asks, what are your expectations regarding the approach to tech companies of the two candidates? But I think maybe there's even a broader question of to what extent can tech companies determine their own agendas and are able to implement them? What's your comment?
This is a very good question. And I think one of the questions that challenges the most US-based political analysts, no matter your color, because the tech giants are not something that have occurred on themselves. The tech giants became so big also because of policy, also because of regulation. And Western governments are definitely supporting the rapid growth of big tech giants. Governments also central banks reduce interest rates to zero or below zero to allow corporate giants and tech giants to take over the competitors so that they could buy the competitors for free, for basically zero, for basically just some cash and a lot of, cheap loans. So this is all part of government policy to make big corporations bigger yet. There is a downside to it though. Those corporations, especially in social media and tech, they have a big influence on what people read and see. And yes, that is a concern that I have. And I think many people share that concern. And in a world where our moral rules or moral codes are disintegrating and changing, and I don't want to say that everything that is new is bad, but what we used to have until the 1970s and 80s is being eroded. And we don't have yet a new system, a new rule book, a new code of ethics. In this difficult transition, that everything goes. Basically, companies can decide what people read, what people see. And I don't want to point any fingers to anybody. I think it's difficult. I don't see any easy solution for this. Some people on the Democratic side would like to break them up. That's a possibility. And it is actually likely that it will happen at one point. We saw that also with big oil some 100 years ago, that governments had to break them up.
Thank you. Actually, that leads to a question from Elko Fioli. Can you please speak a bit more about the moral decay cause and effect?
Wow, this is one of the questions I was not hoping to be asked. Well, apologies. Let me turn this off. An automatic printing here in the background. Well, I think that much of what we're seeing, I was given a speech a couple of weeks ago, and I was asked the same question. And I have to say that I believe this is the only honest answer to this, is it is as a systemic thing. When we speak about the moral change, moral decay, no matter how you mention it, or the decline, the erosion of our moral values in our society, it's not something that we can point a finger on other people. I believe the more honest answer is this is something systemic. It's happening. We're all part of this. Society is changing. And as a macroeconomist, what I'm more concerned about is the fact that that the balance and checks we used to have in Western democracies and capitalistic free market systems is not working. Financial markets should not be allowing governments to print money to buy shares and stocks in real estate, maybe for 1 month in a crisis, but not for 10 years. Financial markets shouldn't allow credit rating companies to rate European countries, investment grade, while countries that have a much better fiscal position, with a lower credit rating. Financial markets shouldn't tolerate this, that the governments are setting the yield curve, and that the governments are dictating not only the bond supply, but also the bond demand. Financial markets shouldn't accept that for too long, but they are, because asset prices are rising, so they want to benefit from it. I think that financial markets have lost their moral compass as well, but we cannot just put a finger on them. This is part of a systemic change. So I believe that the true, probably the origin of this is in the heart of man. Where did it begin? Well, I think this would be the topic for another conversation, but I think at the center of this is the heart of man. People at one point decided to actually desire more for less work. I don't know. There are always, options in life. I believe it started somewhere in the 1970s and 80s. As an economist, I can pinpoint at that time. And we're still in this process. And this moral decay, the moral change, let's put it as this, moral change is impacting everything. It's impacting foreign policy, it's impacting the way we implement ESG, it's impacting the way we deal with nations that don't respect human rights. When we enter big deals with them and we give them access to everything, the same access we give to nations that respect human rights and that have the same social security systems that we do, we are making a big moral mistake when we do that. We actually are enabling and strengthening repressive systems that will later probably come and haunt us. So this is actually what I see in the future for the West. This is also one of the reasons why I see the decline of the West.
Well, that's not terribly encouraging. To what extent? Let me just maybe bring it to a more pragmatic level. One of the safeguards in the West is NATO, the NATO organization. Do you see that the West can't? You mentioned that the U.S. and the UK are the significant military forces at the moment. Do you see that NATO can be revived and serve its purpose as protecting Western interests?
It could do, but without the United States. But if Mr. Biden wins, I think NATO could see a short-term revival, a temporary revival. But in itself, NATO will not be able to survive really or operate really as a true alliance. For marketing reasons, North America and Europe have to keep NATO alive, and for many, many reasons. There is no reason why you would end it. You have to pretend it's there and it's alive. So both have an interest to keep it, to pretend that it's doing well and it's alive. But de facto, it's doomed. The reason is Europe, Western Europe, has already dismantled the strategic military forces. They are dismantled. And it takes at least 7 to 10 years to build them up. It takes a huge amount of money to build them up. So Europe cannot defend herself, cannot even defend the United States. It can only take the US into war. Why should any general want that in the United States? I mean, you have to have a very strong ideological backup spine to do that. It doesn't make any sense for the US to do that. So in that sense, the de facto situation now is this. The de facto situation now is this, that the US has stands up to NATO, but there are actually three different levels of commitment to partners. There are some partners with very high commitment. The US has a very high commitment towards Poland, towards Romania, and especially towards Britain. We have to put probably Britain first there, Britain, Poland, Romania in that order, but also Portugal. And the other states in the EU, in NATO, are a problem because they are embracing the biggest enemies of the US, or the biggest rivals of the US. They are embracing Iran, they are embracing China, even Russia to some extent. So to the extent that European NATO partners are doing deals and entering strategic alliances with Russia, China, Iran, which many in the US Congress perceive as threats to the US national security, it will be really difficult for this alliance to be more than, I would say, I don't want to say it's just a marketing alliance. It is an alliance that works and will work, and there will be many cases where it will be called up and it will serve, but it is a dying alliance. NATO is a dying alliance, and that's the reason why the United States, even many Democrats accepted, is in the process of building a new alliance, and some NATO partners will be part of it, but not all of that.
Well, Christian, we'd like to thank you very much for this very interesting talk. On the one hand, you said the US election may not matter, but you've certainly highlighted a lot of issues that do matter. So those who are looking for some comfort pre-November 3rd, I think you've just changed the nightmare. So, but thank you very much for bringing this all to our attention. Well, and thank you to everyone who's participated as attendees, and we appreciate all the people who ask questions, but especially to you, Christian. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody.